March 24th, 1976. Ryazan, a provincial Soviet city southeast of Moscow. For 2 days, no one had seen the Mironov family from apartment 32 on Pervomaysky Prospect. Their curtains stayed drawn. Their window, usually lit by a warm evening lamp, remained dark. That morning, 3 neighbors gathered outside their door. They had knocked again and again, no answer. Finally, they forced the lock. The door opened to silence, not the silence of sleep or absence, but something colder. Inside, the apartment looked as if time had stopped mid-breath. The beds were made. Dishes dried neatly beside the sink. A teacup stood on the kitchen table, half a ring of brown where the last drop had dried. Everything was in its place, and yet everything was wrong. There were no coats by the door, no shoes lined neatly against the wall, no photographs on the shelves. The wardrobes hung open empty. 14 years of life had been erased overnight. Tamara Belova, the neighbor who had shared tea with Irina Mironova just 3 days earlier, walked through the rooms, calling their names. Her voice echoed in spaces that still held the memory of their presence and yet answered only with hollow air. It was as if the air itself remembered who had been here and grieved. Within hours, the militia would arrive. They would seal the door, write their reports, and issue explanations that made no sense. But before the state arrived to overwrite reality, the neighbors of Building 7 stood in that doorway and felt it, the unmistakable chill of something incomprehensible. A family had vanished, not escaped, not fled, erased. And in the Soviet Union of 1976, there was only one organization capable of making people vanish so completely: the KGB. How could an entire Soviet family disappear overnight? And why did no one ever dare to ask again? To understand how an entire family could vanish, you must first know who they were and how ordinary their lives seemed before the state decided they no longer deserved to exist. The Mironovs lived on the 3rd floor of building number 7, a 5-story Khrushchevka like thousands across the Soviet Union. Concrete walls, peeling paint, thin floors through which you could hear your neighbor's radio, his cough, his arguments. Their apartment, 2 rooms, 48 square meters, had been assigned in 1962, the year Oleg and Irina were married. For 14 years, they had built a life within those narrow walls, neither rich nor poor, neither heroes nor dissidents. Just another Soviet family. Oleg Mikhailovich Mironov was 42, a tool and die machinist at the Ryazan machine building plant. His hands were calloused, his fingers permanently darkened with oil that never washed away. He spoke little, worked hard, and obeyed the rhythms of Soviet Life Party meetings, production quotas, and patriotic slogans. He was the kind of man who nodded at the right times during political lectures and stayed late at the workshop when machines failed. In another world, he would have been invisible, but in the Soviet Union, invisibility was safety. His wife, Irina Sergeyevna, was 39, a teacher of Russian literature at school number 14. She loved Pushkin, Tolstoy, and Akhmatova, the forbidden poet whose verses survived only in whispers. To her students, Irina was strict but fair, passionate about words. Sometimes, when reading from War and Peace or the Brothers Karamazov, her voice would lower and soften, as if she was speaking not to a classroom, but to something deeper inside herself. She never criticized the party, never spoke out loud of her doubts, but her students sensed it, that quiet rebellion that lived between her lines. They had 2 children, Maxim, 13, who loved to take apart old radios, and Anna, 9, bright, talkative, forever asking questions that adults preferred not to answer. They were ordinary Soviet children, shaped by red scarves and school songs, learning how to smile in photographs of Lenin, how to speak safely even when they didn't yet understand what safety meant. Their life followed a pattern that millions of Soviet families share. Oleg left home at dawn, walking to the number 12 bus that carried him to the factory district. Irina woke earlier still, preparing kasha and tea, braiding Anna's hair, packing Maxim's notebook into his satchel. At 7, Oleg's shift began. He worked in the tool and die shop, cutting precision components measured in fractions of millimeters. Machines groaned, sparks flew. Every movement was exact, mechanical, almost ritual. At school, Irina lectured before a class of teenagers whose eyes often drifted to the frost on the window glass. She spoke of literature as if it could save them, though she never said from what. Between classes, she sipped weak tea, glanced at the portrait of Lenin on the wall, and reminded herself not to linger on dangerous thoughts. The Mironovs' evenings were quiet. They ate dinner at the small kitchen table beneath a flickering bulb. Sometimes, Oleg would help Maxim repair a radio or teach him to polish the lathe pieces he brought from work. Irina would sit by the window, mending clothes or reading aloud, not the assigned socialist works, but poems from the Silver Age, kept hidden beneath the tablecloth. After the children went to bed, Oleg and Irina spoke in low voices, the kind used only when the walls were thin. They talked about shortages, the price of bread, and what kind of future their children might have. They did not talk about politics. In the Soviet Union, even silence was a form of self-defense. Their closest neighbor, Tamara Belova, lived across the hall. She and Irina shared everything: sugar, gossip, books that should not be read too often. They were ordinary women who complained about ration lines and worn-out shoes. Yet beneath those daily conversations, Tamara sensed something fragile in Irina, as if she carried a small flame she was trying to keep alive in a storm. Ryazan itself was a city caught between eras, ancient churches overshadowed by factories, smoke, and the smell of oil. Its proximity to Moscow made it a hub of industry and surveillance. Every factory, every school had its commissar, its quiet men who asked careful questions about loyalty and ideological reliability. Everyone knew the KGB was watching, but no one ever knew from where. Still, the Mironovs survived by playing their roles. Oleg attended party meetings and clapped at the proper moments. Irina smiled during May Day parades and waved her red flag. Maxim wore his pioneer scarf with pride, and Anna recited verses about Lenin's kindness to children. They did everything right, everything that should have kept them safe, but safety, in that world, was an illusion built on silence. And silence, once broken, could not be repaired. Because 6 months before that empty apartment on Pervomaysky Prospect, Oleg Mironov made a mistake. A small, honest mistake that would begin the slow machinery of their destruction. It began, as so many Soviet tragedies did, with a single sentence spoken at the wrong time, in the wrong room, before the wrong ears. September 1975. The Ryazan machine-building plant, grey walls, the smell of oil and metal filings, and a meeting room lined with portraits of party leaders watching from the walls. Every worker was required to attend the Partiynoye Sobranie, the party meeting, a ritual designed not to solve problems, but to prove loyalty. At these gatherings, the pattern was always the same. The foreman would speak of the 5-year plan, of quotas unmet and socialist enthusiasm to be renewed. Workers would raise their hands to offer rehearsed suggestions: more labor, more discipline, more commitment to the collective. No one spoke of the real problems: broken machines, stolen materials, missing spare parts. Those were not ideological issues and therefore not to be discussed. But that evening, something shifted. Oleg Mironov was tired. He had worked a double shift the day before, fighting with a lathe that overheated every hour because the cooling system hadn't been serviced in years. He listened to the foreman speak about revolutionary productivity, and before he could stop himself, his hand rose. It was a gesture of reflex, an honest man trying to fix what was broken. When the foreman nodded, Oleg stood, clearing his throat. He spoke slowly, respectfully, choosing his words with care. "Comrade Chairman," he said, "perhaps instead of demanding higher output, we should repair the machines that keep breaking. We lose hours each week because of faulty bearings, because spare parts never arrive. The men are willing, but the tools are not." There was a silence, brief, but sharp, the kind of silence that falls when everyone realizes something dangerous has been said. The foreman smiled tightly. He He thanked Oleg for his concern, noted it in his notebook, and moved on. The meeting continued, speeches resumed, but a line had been crossed, and no one dared to look at Oleg afterward. In the Soviet Union, truth was not rewarded, it was recorded. 2 days later, an entry appeared in Oleg's Lichnoy Delo, his personal file, displayed critical attitude toward party economic directives. Requires observation for ideological deviation. Just one line, a bureaucratic phrase among thousands, but it was enough. In the machinery of state surveillance, even a whisper could become a crime. At first, nothing happened. Oleg continued his work, unaware that his name had been quietly marked. But the factory was under review by the KGB's Second Directorate, investigating the plant's chief engineer for contact with Western visitors. The presence of any unreliable elements among the workers could worsen his case. And so, Oleg's remark became evidence not against him alone, but against his superior. In February 1976, as Moscow prepared for the 25th Party Congress, the KGB issued a directive to its regional offices: identify and neutralize all individuals marked for ideological unreliability before the Congress convened. It was an invisible purge, carried out quietly, without arrests, without trials, just administrative resolutions. The Ryazan office received its quota. Names were pulled from files, marked with red stamps, reviewed by men who had never met those they condemned. One of those men was Major Yevgeny Andreevich Kuzmin, 34, ambitious, precise, a loyal servant of the organs of state security. He had spent years in counterintelligence and now sought promotion to Moscow headquarters. He knew what the system rewarded: vigilance, decisiveness, the elimination of risk before risk became visible. When Kuzmin opened Oleg Mironov's file, he saw not a machinist's frustration, but a potential infection. A worker who questioned the plan, a teacher wife who shaped young minds, 2 children old enough to repeat what they heard at home. His report was clinical. Subject Mironov, OM, demonstrates latent oppositionist tendencies, family environment ideologically contaminated through spouse's profession. Recommend administrative resolution under Article 17b, preventive removal from civilian environment. He sent the file up the chain. Colonel Dmitry Pavlovich Olov, head of the Ryazan KGB office, signed the approval on March 19th. The operation was classified Category 4, full family processing. There was no trial, no warrant, no official accusation, only a line on paper and a plan. In the days that followed, preparations began. Apartment 32 was quietly mapped. Shift schedules were checked to ensure the neighbor's absence. A locksmith from the housing department was summoned under a false work order to provide access. An unmarked van was requested from the Ministry of Internal Affairs. 8 operatives were chosen. The lead officer, Major Kuzmin himself. The order was simple: conduct removal of subjects, Mironov, 4 persons. Secure all personal effects for archival processing. Leave furnishings. Maintain discretion. No disturbances. IMSEC. It was scheduled for the night of March 22nd between 3 and 4 a.m., when the building would be asleep and no one would hear the soft knock on the door that would end 4 lives. What began as a single sentence in a factory meeting had now become a classified operation authorized by the state. In the Soviet system, a word could become a weapon, and once released, it could never be recalled. Night fell over Ryazan on March 22nd, 1976. The streets emptied early, the kind of silence that hung over Soviet cities long after curfew lamps flickered on. Inside apartment 32, the Mironov family was preparing for bed. Oleg had finished repairing a loose switch in the kitchen. Irina folded a pile of freshly washed clothes, humming softly to a tune that belonged to her childhood. Maxim was reading a manual on radio circuits. Anna was already asleep, one arm dangling over the side of the bed. Outside, in the courtyard below, a black Gaz 24 Volga idled with its lights off. The driver smoked in silence. Beside him, another man adjusted his watch. 2:57. They waited for the signal. Across town, Major Yevgeny Kuzmin checked his clipboard for the last time. Everything had been approved: the vehicles, the sedatives, the holding cells, the report forms that would justify the operation afterward. In KGB language, it was called administrative liquidation of domestic elements. No emotion, no ambiguity, 8 operatives, 1 family. Objective: complete removal. At precisely 3 a.m., the team entered building number 7. Their footsteps made no sound on the worn stairwell. One carried a small case with medical instruments. Another held a camera documentation required for every operation to prove that removal had been performed correctly. The locksmith had already provided access. The key turned smoothly in the lock. Inside the apartment, everything was still. The clock on the wall ticked softly, the second hand moving through the last calm moments of 4 lives. Major Kuzmin gave a slight nod. The door opened. They moved quickly, practiced, wordless. 2 operatives entered the parents' room first. Oleg woke in confusion, his instincts sharper than his fear. He sat up, about to speak, but a gloved hand pressed against his chest, another over his mouth. "Stay quiet, comrade," one man whispered. "There's been an accident." Oleg tried to rise. He was forced down. Within seconds, his wrists were bound with plastic restraints. He saw Irina sit up beside him, wide-eyed, her breath catching as a syringe touched her arm. Her body went limp almost instantly. In the children's room, a woman operative shook Maxim gently awake. "Don't be afraid," she said softly. "We're taking you to your parents. Everything will be fine." Her tone was calm, rehearsed. Anna stirred, blinking, confused. Within a minute, both children were dressed in their coats and shoes. The operation took less than 10 minutes. The family was led down the stairwell, Irina half-conscious, Oleg restrained, the children guided by hands that looked almost kind. The door to apartment 32 was closed behind them, but not locked. One man remained inside to begin the second phase, erasure. He moved through each room methodically, removing personal items, photographs, clothing, school notebooks, letters, sewing kits, recipe cards. Every trace of individuality went into sealed bags. Within an hour, the apartment would look like an empty stage waiting for its next occupants. Outside, 3 vehicles waited. Oleg was placed in one, Irina in another, the children in a third. Each vehicle departed separately, following routes designed to avoid detection. In less than 20 minutes, building number 7 was silent again. Oleg's vehicle drove to the administrative compound on Soviet Street, a building that looked like any other office block, but whose basement held windowless cells. He was processed without explanation. Photographed, fingerprinted, examined. No charges were read, no questions asked. He was placed in a small concrete cell, lit by a single dim bulb that never turned off. On the wall was a slogan painted years before: "Silence is safety." Oleg would come to understand its meaning. Meanwhile, Irina and the children were driven north 60 kilometers through pine forests and snow-covered fields to a facility once listed as a tuberculosis sanatorium. Now it was a transit point, officially erased from maps, a place for people who no longer existed in the Soviet Union's paper world. They arrived before dawn. The gates were steel, the air sharp with disinfectant and cold. A woman in a grey coat greeted them, clipboard in hand. She smiled without warmth. "Welcome to Facility 147, she said. Inside, the family was separated. Irina was taken to a small room and told to rest. The sedative kept her numb, floating between fear and disbelief. The children were led down a corridor with peeling green paint to what had once been a pediatric ward. There were drawings still faintly visible on the walls, relics of a time when this place had healed the sick instead of disappearing them. Over the next several days, a bureaucratic ritual unfolded. Each family member was assigned a number. Their medical and psychological evaluations were conducted by officers trained to write exactly what the state required. That Oleg displayed ideological instability, that Irina had been exposed to counter-revolutionary influence, that the children were at risk of antisocial attitudes. Their photographs were taken from 3 angles, then attached to files stamped "Classified, Do Not Register." Their names were quietly deleted from local census lists, school records, and factory rosters. Even their internal passports were voided and stored in sealed archives. Legally, they no longer existed. Back in Ryazan, the process of forgetting had already begun. At the factory, Oleg's supervisor convened a meeting and announced that Comrade Mironov had been selected for a classified assignment in the Urals. He emphasized the need for discretion. At school number 14, Irina's principal told the teachers she had transferred to a prestigious special school in another city. No forwarding address, no questions allowed. The children's classmates were informed that Maxim and Anna had moved to care for relatives. Within a week, the story hardened into fact. The Mironovs were gone, relocated, reassigned, promoted. No one spoke of them again. On March 25th, the KGB returned to apartment 32 with a moving crew from the city housing office. Furniture was carried out, piece by piece. Walls were repainted, floorboards scrubbed. By evening, the space was bare, a blank shell waiting to be filled by another family who would never know what had happened before them. 3 days later, a young couple moved in, both engineers from the oil refinery. They brought a new rug, a television, a set of dishes. They laughed as they hung curtains, happy to have found an apartment so quickly. They never wondered why the wallpaper smelled of fresh paint, or why the woman from the housing office insisted they sign the lease without delay. That same night, in the sanatorium north of Ryazan, Irina was allowed to see her children for 1 hour. They were frightened, but unharmed. She told them everything would be all right, words she no longer believed. A guard watched from the doorway, writing notes in a small black book. At the end of the hour, they were led away in different directions. Irina reached out to touch Anna's hand, but the door closed before she could. Somewhere, far away, a bureaucrat stamped the final form. Subject Mironov, processed. The operation was over. 8 men would file brief reports. Each would be commended for efficiency and discretion. For them, it was one of dozens of similar actions carried out that year, a routine task in the maintenance of national stability. For the Mironovs, it was the end of their world. And for everyone else in building number 7, it was as if nothing had ever happened. For most of Ryazan, the disappearance of the Mironov family ended the day their apartment door was sealed. Life in the Soviet Union had a rhythm of forgetting one that rewarded silence. Questions were dangerous. Curiosity could be mistaken for subversion. And so, people moved on. But for Tamara Belova, who lived across the hall, the silence became unbearable. She had seen Irina every day for years. Their children played together, they borrowed sugar, shared tea and whispers about books that were hard to find. 3 days before the disappearance, they had sat by the window discussing Akhmatova's poems, those forbidden verses of sorrow and endurance. Now Irina was gone, and Tamara could not make peace with the official story. She had heard it from the building's domcom, the House representative, who read from a neatly typed notice: the Mironov family has been reassigned to a new housing unit due to work relocation. All matters regarding apartment 32 have been resolved through official channels. The explanation was clean, bureaucratic, and false. Tamara knew it. Everyone knew it. But none of the neighbors wanted to acknowledge what they knew. They lowered their voices when passing that door, as if afraid that even memory could be overheard. 2 nights later, she saw men in dark coats, carrying furniture out of the Mironovs' apartment. No names, no uniforms, just efficient hands, working quietly until the rooms were empty. By morning, the official tape sealing the door was gone. In its place, a faint smell of paint and disinfectant. Still, Tamara couldn't let go. She went to Oleg's factory, pretending to deliver a message. The clerk at the personnel department looked at her with weary eyes. "Comrade Mironov has been transferred to a classified facility," he said flatly. "No correspondence permitted." When she pressed further, his tone hardened. "That's all you need to know." At the school, she asked for Irina's forwarding address. The principal, pale and nervous, handed her a printed notice from the regional education office. Due to reassignment under state order, personal information cannot be disclosed. Tamara walked home through the snow that afternoon, her hands shaking, not from the cold, but from a realization too dangerous to name. The Mironovs had not moved. They had been removed. The following week, there was a knock at her door. It was early evening. Her husband was still at work. Standing in the hallway was a man in a grey suit, mid-30s, polite, clean-shaven. He smiled faintly. "Comrade Belova, I'm here on behalf of state security. May I come in?" Her throat went dry, but she stepped aside. He entered quietly, as if he had done this many times before. He declined tea. He didn't remove his coat. "You were close to the Mironov family," he began. "You often visited them, yes?" "Yes," Tamara answered carefully. "We were neighbors." "Ill? What kind of people were they?" "Ordinary," she said. "Good workers, good parents." Did Comrade Mironova ever express dissatisfaction with the Soviet way of life? Any criticism of the party, of our leadership, of her working conditions? The questions were spoken gently, but the air in the room grew heavy. Tamara understood what this was not an inquiry, but a test. Every word she spoke would determine how much she herself could still be trusted. She shook her head. "Never," she said firmly. She was a loyal teacher. "We talked only about children, food, books, nothing political." The officer wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked up, his expression unreadable. "It is important, Comrade Belova, to respect the privacy of those serving the state in sensitive positions. Unnecessary curiosity can sometimes be misunderstood." He closed his notebook, nodded politely, and left. The conversation had lasted less than 15 minutes. When the door shut behind him, Tamara sank into a chair and trembled. She realized, with a terrible clarity, that she had just helped bury her friend, not with earth, but with silence. Far away, in the northern forests of Perm Oblast, the Mironov family was still alive in body, if not in name. The sanatorium north of Ryazan was only a transit point. After 2 weeks of processing, the 4 of them were transported by rail under escort to Special Administrative Point 147, a remote detention facility deep in the Ural Mountains. Officially, it didn't exist. On maps, the area was marked simply as Forestry Sector. In reality, it was a camp for those the state had decided to forget. The journey took 4 days. The train had no markings, no windows in the passenger cars. Guards referred to them not as people, but as subjects. Each carried a small tag with an assigned number. Ole 4500, Irina 4500, Maxim 4404, Anna 4505. At the camp, they were separated upon arrival. Oleg was placed in the male barracks, assigned to the woodworking shop. Irina was sent to the kitchen. The children, too young for labor, were kept in what the guards called the school, a converted barrack run by other detainees. The rules were simple: no questions, no complaints, no contact between barracks except on Sundays. Every Sunday afternoon, they were allowed 1 hour together under supervision. Oleg would hold his children, Irina would try to smile. They talked about the weather, about food, about the day they would go home, though all of them understood that no such day would come. In that camp, people didn't serve sentences. They simply existed in indefinite suspension. They were neither prisoners nor citizens. Their names had been erased from every record, their addresses reassigned, their workbooks destroyed. The Soviet Union was a vast system of paperwork, and to be deleted from that paperwork was to cease being human. Some detainees whispered about where they had come from, a wrong word at a party meeting, a letter intercepted, a joke told to the wrong person. Many had been there for years, waiting for orders that never arrived. Oleg worked quietly in the workshop, his hands still steady, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion. The guards left him alone. He obeyed every rule, but each time he saw Irina, she seemed thinner, her face paler, her hair streaked with gray she hadn't had before. The children grew in silence, their childhood measured not in school years, but in winters survived. Back in Ryazan, the apartment that had once been theirs was filled with new laughter, new furniture, new life. The young couple who moved in had a baby in the spring. When the child was born, the neighbors congratulated them, and no one mentioned the family who had lived there before. Years passed. The Mironovs became ghosts in the bureaucracy, a sealed file in the archives of the KGB, a row of numbers in a ledger kept by men who would never see the faces behind them. Oleg died on March 3rd, 1983. The cause, myocardial infarction, heart failure. He was 49. The report was typed neatly, stamped, and filed under case closed. Irina's name appeared on no further records, no date of death, no note of release, only absence. The same for Maxim and Anna. Whether they survived until the camp's closure in 1989 or perished in the endless winters of the Urals, no one knows. After the Soviet collapse, in 1993, a researcher found a document in the Perm Regional KGB archives. It listed detainees of Facility 147. 4 names caught his attention: Oleg, Irina, Maxim, and Anna Mironov. Next to them, a line of cold, bureaucratic precision. Arrival, the 12th of April, 1976. Disposition, administrative retention. Termination, as ordered, nothing more. The state had succeeded in its purpose. The Mironovs were erased not only from existence, but from memory. Their neighbors learned to forget. Their colleagues learned to believe. Even Tamara, years later, could no longer be certain what was real and what she had imagined. Had they truly lived across the hall, or was it only a dream swallowed by the machinery of history? This was the genius and the horror of the Soviet system. It didn't just destroy people, it destroyed the proof that they had ever lived. In the end, Oleg's crime was not treason. It was truth, the simplest, most dangerous thing a man could speak aloud. And in a nation built on fear, truth was the one thing the state could never forgive. The official story of the Mironov family ended in 1976, sealed inside an archive stamped top secret. But history, no matter how tightly controlled, has a way of remembering. It hides in forgotten documents, in whispers that survive in the minds of those who once dared to care. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, thousands of classified files were left behind in the chaos. For a brief moment, a few fragile years, truth began to leak through the cracks of empire. Former KGB officers, uncertain of their futures, sold or surrendered old case files. Archivists in provincial cities opened cabinets that had been locked for decades. And in the dusty basement of the Perm Oblast Administration Building, one researcher made a discovery. He had been cataloging remnants from Special Administrative Point 147. The Ural facility, long dismissed as a myth. Among hundreds of pages of yellowed paper, he found a ledger marked simply Retention Records, 1975, 1985. The handwriting was meticulous, the language bureaucratic, cold. Every entry listed 4 things: a number, a date of arrival, a cause of detention, and a final notation disposition. And there, among the names, were 4 consecutive entries. 4,172, Mironov, Oleg Mikhailovich, arrival. 12 April 1976. Cause, ideological instability, disposition, deceased. The 3rd of March, 1983. 4,173, Mironova, Irina Sergeyevna, arrival. 12 April 1976. Cause, familial association, disposition, ongoing. 4174. Mironov, Maxim Olegovich, arrival. 12 April 1976. Cause, dependent, minor, disposition, ongoing. 4175. Mironova, Anna Olegovna, arrival. 12 April 1976, Cause, dependent minor, disposition, ongoing, no release date, no record of transfer, no confirmation of death, just silence, as if the state itself had exhaled and refused to breathe again. The researcher who found it, a man named Pavel Larin, later said in an interview, it was as though they had been buried twice, once by the men who took them and once by time. He copied the pages before they disappeared again into new bureaucracies, scanned them onto an early computer, and sent them to a Moscow journalist who had been investigating the vanishing families of the 1,970 seconds. Her article, published in 1994, was brief but haunting. A Soviet family erased the Mironov case. It circulated quietly in the new Russia, ignored by most, but remembered by a few. Back in Ryazan, building number 7 still stood on Pervomaisky Prospect. The walls had been repainted, the stairwell repaired, the apartments privatized in the wave of 1,990 seconds reforms. The new residents had no idea that their home once belonged to ghosts. But one person still remembered. Tamara Belova was an old woman by then, her hair white, her eyes still sharp. She had survived the long years of conformity and the collapse that followed. One winter morning, she saw the article about the Mironovs in a Moscow newspaper delivered to her doorstep. She froze as she read their names: Oleg, Irina, Maxim, Anna. For the first time in 17 years, the silence broke. Tamara took the article, folded it carefully, and placed it in a small box, along with Irina's old teacup, the only thing left behind in apartment 32, forgotten in the cupboard the night of the disappearance. She whispered a prayer she hadn't dared to say in decades. The next day, she went to the building's courtyard. Children were playing where the black Volga had once parked that night. The city had changed, but the shadows had not. Tamara knew there would be no justice, no graves to visit, no answers. But she also knew that remembering was, in itself, an act of defiance. They wanted us to forget, she said quietly to a neighbor. So I remember. That's my revenge. In modern Russia, the archives of the KGB, now the FSB, have once again closed. Documents that once saw daylight in the 1,990 seconds are now sealed under national security. Officials insist that such stories belong to a complicated past, a phrase that hides as much as it reveals. But fragments of the truth still circulate: photocopies, family recollections, digital scans shared online. The Mironov case has become a symbol among historians of what they call administrative erasure, the Soviet practice of removing individuals not through trial or execution, but through deletion. They were not killed in the public sense. They were simply removed from every record, erased from the social fabric, until even their neighbors questioned whether they had existed at all. In this way, the Soviet system achieved something even more terrifying than death. It destroyed memory. When a person is shot, others remember. When a person is erased, memory itself becomes treason. In 2001, long after the story had faded from newspapers, a small plaque appeared on the wall of building number 7 in Ryazan. It bore no names, no dates, only a short inscription. In this place lives once existed that the state sought to forget. No one claimed responsibility for placing it. Some said it was the work of a local historian. Others whispered it was Tamara herself, who died quietly a few months later. The plaque remains, untouched by officials, too small to provoke anger, too quiet to be noticed by most who pass. At sunset, its metal surface catches the light, a brief shimmer, like memory itself refusing to die. Years later, Western researchers translated the Mironov files. They discovered something chilling. The directive that led to Oleg's removal was not unique. It was part of a quota system issued before the 25th Party Congress in 1976. Across the Soviet Union, hundreds of families were processed under similar orders. Some for spreading anti-Soviet sentiments, some for maintaining contact with foreigners, some for nothing more than a misplaced remark at a meeting. The bureaucracy that consumed them was vast, impersonal, and unstoppable. Paperwork moved faster than people. Once a name was entered, no one had the authority or the courage to erase the mark. So the system erased the person instead. Oleg Mironov's single act, speaking honestly about broken machinery, became the first line in a chain of documents that ended with the extinction of his family. That was how the machine of paranoia worked, through obedience, procedure, and silence. No one thought they were killing anyone. They were just following orders. Today, the name Mironov means nothing to most Russians. Their apartment has been renovated. Children play in the courtyard where the black car once idled. Life goes on as it always does. But for those who still study that era, the Mironovs stand as a warning of how fragile existence becomes when truth itself is forbidden. A man spoke one honest sentence. A file was opened. A family disappeared. And the city learned to pretend that nothing had happened. The tragedy of the Cold War was not only fought in embassies and spy networks, but in the small, quiet rooms where ordinary people lived their lives under extraordinary fear. Each vanished citizen was a battlefield of conscience, each erased family a victory for the machinery of control. In the Soviet Union, power was not measured in armies or tanks. It was measured in the ability to make people disappear, not by death, but by forgetting. The Mironovs left behind no graves, no photographs, no memorials, only the echo of a question that still lingers half a century later. How could a nation so proud of its heroes survive by erasing its own? And if truth could destroy a family, what could silence destroy? This story, like every story of the world we live in today, doesn't end here. If you found these analyses meaningful, please hit like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a comment below. What do you think happened to Maxim and Anna Mironov? Were they freed or forgotten forever? And I'll see you in the next report.